Hey, come on in and spend some time with the film hobbyist. My name is Lydia, and I love movies. We're here in my attic room. You're sitting on a forest green Walmart futon with a black metal frame. I'm in an old desk chair with cracks in the pleather lining. On the floor next to us are piles of fabric scraps and various sewing accoutrements. I apologize for the mess. My daughter just started sewing lessons and she's been inspired. Sewing and clothing design have been hobbies of hers for years, and I've taught her about everything I know. It was time to get a professional involved. We've actually been planning this for months, but we had to wait for several factors to align. On our part, we had to wait for the end of school year activities to make sure we had the time to devote to this. On her teacher's part, we had to wait for wedding season. At first, that might seem counterintuitive, for wedding season to be a break for a seamstress who makes wedding dresses, but it makes more sense when you sit with it. The work needs to be done before the traveling and the setup and the wedding day. So she's only now free for lessons. Weddings are fairly unique events in the broader American culture. We don't have many universal celebrations of milestones outside of smaller religious or cultural distinctions. We don't have an American celebration of births or age milestones. There's kind of a thing around Sweet 16, but not really. There's a little bit of fuss around high school graduations, but only grandparents would travel across country for that. As far as events where a whole family or community gather for ritual, again, outside of particular smaller religious or cultural distinctions, it's weddings and funerals. I'm not even talking about the actual events themselves, not the wedding ceremony and reception, not the funeral service, but the gathering before that. The family and friends packed into several houses or a hotel, running errands, filling time, working together to make centerpieces or table cards, decorating the event space. There are formal meals and speeches, and informal ones on the floor or packed in a corner. In a funeral, there's a shroud of sadness that comes in waves, and joy bursts through anyway in the pockets, in the time together. With a wedding, it's the opposite. There's a fervent atmosphere of desired happiness and excitement, an expectation of positivity. And if you are the person carrying pain or anger or tension or frustration, which is always there at the corner of a stressful emotional event, the amount of repression that is expected of you can be quite high. In most films, this is a source of high melodrama or absurd comedy, perhaps some sweet sentimentalism. Father of the Bride, all versions, center this in the comedic expense of everything, a father watching his money walk out the door. Steel Magnolias focuses some on the wedding setup, but mostly on the single piece of getting hair done before the ceremony, spending time with the mother of the bride's friends. Romantic comedies tend to focus on relationships between the members of the wedding parties, frequently who the best man or maid of honor sleeps with. But there aren't many films that capture the long trajectory of the days before, of the boredom, and the final plans, and the errands, and the rising tension, quite like 2008's Rachel Getting Married, directed by Jonathan Demme. You probably haven't heard of this movie. That's okay. It's a small independent film that made an award splash, mostly in nominations for the movie, but especially for lead actress Anne Hathaway. Up until this point, she was mostly known for being a pretty face in chick flicks. I think her comedy skills in The Princess Diaries are underrated, but you have to admit that she's the least showy performer of the Devil Wears Prada cast. She had a well-buzzed-about supporting role in Brokeback Mountain, but it was an outlier definitely overshadowed by the rest of the conversation about that film. Rachel Getting Married is the movie where the film criticism community realized that Anne Hathaway really could act by playing a character who is spiny and prickly and a mess rather than the polished, charming brunettes she usually played. Her protagonist, Kim, is no princess. Physically, yeah, she's Anne Hathaway in a messy haircut and smeared makeup, but character-wise, she is a deeply complex individual, responding to real past traumas with an abrasive, hot mess, always say the wrong thing chattiness. And her performance completely deserves all the attention it got. There's a version of this story that is an intense wedding-themed melodrama, all of the deep secrets in clear exposition, plot twists revealed on a dime, with a swell of music and dramatic camera moves. But this movie is something else, an incredibly grounded, complex portrait of family dysfunction, where the ones we love and enjoy time with have caused the most pain. What really struck me the first time I watched it is how the film reveals the layers of trauma naturally, as we just experience each day leading up to the wedding. Plot twists only because of reverse dramatic irony, where we are learning what the characters already know as they navigate the complicated steps of wedding ritual, gathering, rehearsal dinner, wedding setup, wedding day. The second time I watched it, the real surprise was how the plot twists, how these reveals all sat out in plain sight, discussed far before the audience even knows what is being talked about, hidden in all the ordinary. Rachel Getting Married tells the story of Kim, a young woman in recovery from many years of abusing drugs and alcohol. She's been sober for 9 months, largely because she's been in rehab. We meet her just as she is released temporarily for her sister Rachel's wedding. Kim has a history. With something like a decade of struggle with addiction, it would be hard for that not to be the case. And that history is complicated. There's deep tragedy here, and there's also the fallout from a collection of bad decisions. Kim is very unlikable. She's full of insults and justifications and is a bit attention-seeking. But she also earns our pity. She's frequently putting her foot in her mouth, saying the wrong thing at the wrong time, trying to be familiar in situations where she ought to be formal, abrasive when she ought to be soft. There aren't easy explanations here either. We never learn when or why she started using. We don't learn the veracity or timeline of other events in the family. But what makes this story so amazing is that open-endedness that lets the audience fill in the blanks, a lot of which comes from the style of filmmaking. This film feels like a fictional documentary. Director Jonathan Demme had a fairly good documentarian filmography, especially music and concert documentaries. And all of that style of filming and editing really plays a huge role in what makes this film special. A good deal of the camera work is handheld digital photography, which now leaves many sequences with slight pixelation, really locking it in time and place. Demme didn't set up shots beforehand, really trusting his camera operators to find interesting angles in each scene to communicate the story. In the story, Kim's father and Rachel's fiancé are in the music business, so there are just musicians everywhere, playing music. It's always in the next room over or just outside. All of the music was improvised. It's the only soundtrack of the film. Music downstairs while we talk in bedrooms. Music outside while we're in the kitchen. Music performances at the rehearsal dinner and wedding itself. The sound production of this film is amazing, capturing all the music live, which contributes to the naturalistic atmosphere. I don't know to what extent the dialogue was improvised. It's possible most of it wasn't, but it wouldn't surprise me if the majority of the scenes had a loose outline and the actors were just allowed to riff. At least, that's how this movie feels, which is, again, it's genius. The ambience hides the very clear plot twists and reveals. I don't want to spoil too much because that journey of discovery really is the engine of this piece. Yeah, the atmosphere is cool, and yeah, Anne Hathaway's performance is completely transformative. And yeah, there might be some cultural commentary and satire with the fact that this wedding is South Asian themed, when the bride's family is white, possibly ethnically Jewish, judged by how often they toast l'chaim, and the groom's family is African American, I guess. But the real fuel here is these character reveals. I will illustrate just a small twist to prove my point. Pretty soon after arriving at their rural Connecticut house, Kim needs to go somewhere for a mandatory drug test and a 12-step meeting. Her dad won't lend her the car, so she ends up riding a bicycle. She bursts into the office, running late, and we watch her pee in a cup, turn it in, and then race over to the complex's other building to try and catch the meeting. She bursts in awkwardly as the guy talking mentions he lives in Hawaii, knocking over a pile of chairs. He finishes his introduction, and the meeting goes on to the next one. We get a montage of the meeting. Introductions, testimonies, encouragements, a piece of a story here, a piece of another there, a collage of the consequences of addiction and the long journey of recovery. The purpose of this sequence is for the viewer to see Kim in an authentic environment with people who have no history with her. She might say to her family that she's in recovery and she's improving, but they've shown skepticism and doubt. And even at this early point in the movie, we don't know who to believe. But she's genuinely listening to the stories here and caring about the circumstances. And when she recites the Serenity Prayer, we can tell she says it with sincerity. As an audience, this purpose is satisfying from a storytelling, character study point of view. What we don't know, because Kim already knows, so there's no reason to say it out loud, is that Rachel's fiance lives in Hawaii. So when Kim walks her bicycle back up the driveway toward her family's house and sees the first speaker at the 12-step meeting, it's a surprise that he's the best man. Kim didn't know. And so both of them get this special connection with being addicts in recovery. And he, as someone who understands, can speak up for her later in the film. An outsider to the family who understands the difficulty of returning home with substantial baggage. And again, this reveal is right out in the open. He's the first guy we see at the meeting. But we're busy following Kim as she crashes into a pile of chairs, so the details of him being from out of town don't really stand out. His important plot point introduction is lost in the shuffle of other people's shared experiences. Because of how ordinary it all is, how documentarian and naturalistic the storytelling, we don't clock this as important. So when it is, the surprise is that much greater. The more I've thought about this film, the more I've realized that the manner of the storytelling really does change the experience of the story. This plot could have been filmed as an incredibly melodramatic family drama, or maybe a dramedy. Like, I can imagine Kim stumbling into the chairs with a bunch of reaction shots from the rest of the 12-step meeting, making it as awkward as possible, drawing attention to the man speaking as he says something like, "I've just come in from out of town," where this scene almost becomes a meet cute. And in that case, you wouldn't need to hear much from the meeting, because the scene would be about a possible romance, not about Kim's sincerity. And then when she came home, maybe he would open the door and they would be like, "Oh, it's you." And someone would notice and say, "Oh, you two know each other?" And then they would laugh, which would make the next scene of them having sex in the basement much more flirty and fun, rather than a further example of how, for all her sincerity, Kim really is unreliable and full of poor judgment. In this other hypothetical film, Kim would be more edgy and less awkward, kind of like a Diablo Cody protagonist, rather than the spiny, volatile, impulsive force she actually is. But this isn't a glossy, melodramatic piece. It's echoey and inefficient. Scenes go on for way longer than they would in other films. There's a long rehearsal dinner sequence where there's a concert with multiple acts we see throughout the film, and a number of speeches from various family members and attendees. It drags. And so we learn not to get in a fuss over whether this enhances the plot, but realize the story it is telling, the way it shows this collection of family and friends, the cultural mix of backgrounds and histories, the moments that most move Kim, and the ones that make Rachel sparkle. Jonathan Demme and cinematographer Declan Quinn told an interviewer that they wanted this to feel like the most beautiful home movie ever made, and I really think they captured that atmosphere. What makes this film different from other artsy, naturalistic kinds of pieces is that there really are genuine plot points here, where the story, as you initially assume, is pulled away layer by layer until you actually understand these people, what happened to them, and how they got here. There is genuine catharsis and hope at the end of this film, all with the open-ended ambiguity promised by its storytelling style and main character. Why tell the story this way, though? Why turn this into a faux home movie? What does filming a wedding scene in real time really accomplish in the end? An American wedding comes with a particular kind of cultural expectation. Weddings carry with them an atmosphere of desired happiness and excitement, an expectation of positivity. If you have any pain or anger or tension or frustration, always there at the corner of a stressful emotional event, you're expected to repress it, to shove it down and keep everything happy. But what if you can't repress it? What if you are a walking, ragged figure of anger and tension and impulsive negativity? What if you have a history of bad choices with horrible consequences that everyone in the room knows about? How can you be filled with positivity? In a sleek melodrama, by virtue of the filmmaking style, there's already a lot we can tell about the characters and the story they're living in. The film tells us where there's a good guy and a bad one, who's the romantic interest and who's the enemy, who was in the right and who was in the wrong. Normal exposition means we can pick up pretty quickly how awful the backstory is, often because it's just told to us. Because of how the naturalistic filmmaking obscures all these details, Kim is actually given the opportunity of a clean slate. The audience doesn't know who she is, or her bad choices, or their consequences. It's pretty clear pretty quickly that she's not a good person, but we are given the opportunity to see a person who might actually be trying to be a better person. In Naturalism, we are able to see her attempt to fit in and begin to pity her for her flaws and pain. We can root for her to not make bad choices. We can have the space to examine our own feelings toward her as the story unfolds. We can notice her there in the background at the wedding, really trying hard to let the story be about Rachel getting married rather than her own baggage. And in that grace, we can quietly reflect on our own pains and rifts and what it might take to find joy again. Thanks for coming.